In November 1881, London's coldest codebreaker was handed a cipher so violently complex the ink looked like barbed wire. It was supposed to hold a disgraced major's confession to high treason. But when she finally cracked the impossible math at 2 a.m., she didn't find treason. She found a fairy tale. She stared at the sequence of letters, the graphite smudged across her pale fingers, her pulse beating a slow, steady rhythm against her collarbone. This was not the architecture of a political assassination. This was the architecture of a man building a fortress around a secret so fragile it required military-grade encryption to protect. But to understand how Henrietta Locke found herself sitting in a freezing Yorkshire manor dissecting a myth, you have to rewind exactly 21 days. You have to step into a room that smelled of expensive brandy and quiet administrative violence. The fire in Lord Julian Vance's office burned with a perfectly regulated heat, much like the man himself. Henrietta sat perfectly still in a leather wingback chair, her hands folded over her charcoal gray skirt, her breathing deliberately shallow. She did not look at the roaring hearth. She looked at the dust motes suspended in the shafts of autumn sunlight, calculating their descent. It was a habit of hers. When the human world became entirely unmanageable, Henrietta counted things. Currently, she was counting the seconds it took for Lord Vance to stop pouring his drink and turn around to face her. 18 seconds. A deliberate display of power. Lord Vance did not threaten to kill her. That would have been amateurish. And Vance was a man who took pride in destroying a life without ever raising his voice. He threatened her independence. He threatened the quiet, meticulous life she had built out of the ashes of her late father's catastrophic gambling debts. He walked toward his massive oak desk, his footsteps muffled by a Persian rug that cost more than Henrietta earned in 3 years of translating foreign banking ledgers. In his left hand he held a sheaf of promissory notes. The paper was thin, yellowed, and bore her father's frantic, messy signature. The debt had been bought. Vance owned it. Vance owned her. Henrietta diagnosed the threat instantly. She did not weep. She did not beg. She catalogued the physical facts of the room, the exits, the heavy brass paperweight, the satisfied, predatory twitch at the corner of Vance's mouth. He wanted something specific. Men who buy debts always do. He slid the iron-bound ledger across the mahogany desk. It did not look like a diary. It looked like a cage. The leather was scarred, the bindings reinforced with brass rivets that caught the low light of the fire. The book was heavy, dense with secrets, and radiated a kind of sullen hostility. Major Elias Thorne, Vance explained, his voice smooth and frictionless. The butcher of the Afghan frontier. The man who had allegedly sold out his own regiment to secure a lucrative trade route, though the military courts could never prove it. Thorne had retreated to his ancestral estate in Yorkshire, locking himself away from society. But he kept records. He kept this ledger. Vance had acquired it through means he did not bother to explain. The problem was the encryption. 4 of the War Office's finest cryptographers had looked at the ledger. 3 gave up. 1 suffered a nervous collapse. Vance knew Henrietta was better than the War Office. He knew she saw patterns where other people saw chaos. She reached out and touched the cover. The leather was freezing. You have 3 weeks, Henrietta, before the snow traps you both in that godforsaken house, or before he realizes who you really are. Vance leaned forward, his cologne smelling of bergamot and coercion. You will go to Yorkshire under the guise of an archivist hired to appraise his library. You will live in his house. You will decode this journal. Bring me the translation by the 1st of December, or these promissory notes go to the magistrate, and you will spend the rest of your brilliant life in a debtor's prison. The journey north took 3 days and stripped the warmth from her bones degree by degree. By the time the hired coach passed through the final village and began the steep ascent onto the high moors, the world had lost all its color. It was a landscape rendered entirely in charcoal and chalk. The wind did not blow. It howled, carrying a bitter, damp chill that cut straight through her thick wool coat. Henrietta sat shivering in the carriage, the iron-bound ledger resting heavily on her lap, her fingers tracing the brass rivets beneath her gloves. The carriage wheels ground to a halt, not on gravel, but on bone-white cobblestones. The silence of the moors was not empty. It was holding its breath. It was the kind of atmospheric pressure that precedes a devastating winter storm. Henrietta stepped out of the carriage. Ashford Manor loomed against the darkening sky like a physical threat. It was a sprawling, brutalist structure of dark stone, its narrow windows reflecting the bruised purple clouds. Only 2 windows on the ground floor offered the weak yellow glow of lamplight. The rest of the house was entirely dead. An elderly servant with a face like crumpled parchment opened the heavy oak doors before Henrietta could knock. He did not speak. He simply took her single traveling bag and gestured for her to follow him into the cavernous main hall. The air inside was barely warmer than the wind on the moors. The floors were black slate. The tapestries were faded, depicting hunting scenes that looked more like massacres. Henrietta walked slowly, her eyes automatically scanning the structural details of the space, cataloging the anomalies. She noticed the hardware before she noticed the furnishings. There was a massive lock on the drawing room door. The strange thing was, the strike plate and the heavy iron bolt were mounted on the outside. It was designed to keep something in, not out. It was a deliberate, heavy-handed piece of ironwork that spoke of paranoia. A prison inside a fortress. The servant cleared his throat. "Major Thorne will see you now." He stepped out of the shadows. He did not enter the room so much as he materialized from the darkness, a massive, brooding shape that seemed to swallow the weak light of the fireplace. Elias Thorne was a man built on a terrifying scale. His shoulders were impossibly broad, his posture rigidly straight, but it was his face that commanded the air in the room. He expected her to flinch at the ruin of his features. It was the natural human reaction. Instead, Henrietta's eyes tracked the asymmetry of his scars, clinically calculating the trajectory of the shrapnel. The jagged white lines tore across the left side of his jaw, cutting a violent path through his cheek and disappearing into his thick, dark hair. She noted the slight drag of his left foot as he took a step forward. She noted the tension in his right hand, the knuckles white as they gripped the edge of a mahogany table. She did not see a monster. She saw a physics equation that had survived an explosion. She saw trauma rendered in flesh, healed improperly, because the man had likely refused medical rest. "You are the archivist." His voice was a low, resonant rumble. It sounded like stones grinding together deep underground. "I am Henrietta Locke." She kept her voice entirely flat, devoid of intimidation, devoid of warmth. "I have been contracted by your estate managers to catalog the Eastern Library." Thorne stared at her. His remaining eye was a piercing, pale gray, sharp enough to cut glass. He looked at her sensible, unadorned clothing. He looked at the ink calluses on her fingers. He looked at her completely steady posture. There was a flicker of something in his expression. Not surprise, but a deep, cautious suspicion. "The Eastern Library is damp and entirely useless, Miss Locke. You will find nothing of value there. I suggest you take the carriage back to the village before the snow begins." "I have a contract, Major Thorne." Henrietta did not blink. "And I am highly, highly resistant to the cold." Thorne held her gaze for 10 long seconds. The silence between them stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. Finally, he turned away, the drag of his left foot echoing in the vast, empty hall. "Do as you wish. But do not wander the house at night. This architecture is entirely unforgiving." Her bedchamber was located in the west wing, a small, drafty room that smelled faintly of lavender and old dust. The fireplace smoked. The mattress was filled with horsehair and offered the comfort of a wooden plank. Henrietta locked the door, pulled a small wooden desk as close to the struggling fire as she safely could, and set her instruments down. 2 brass calipers, a straight edge, 6 freshly sharpened graphite pencils, a magnifying glass, and the iron-bound ledger. She unfastened the brass clasp and opened the first page. It was not numbers. It was not letters. It was a dense, overlapping architecture of jagged shapes that looked less like a language and more like an act of violence. The ink was applied with furious pressure, the strokes crossing and intersecting in a chaotic web that made her eyes ache. It looked like the scribblings of a madman. But Henrietta knew better. True madness has no structure, And this chaos was painfully, deliberately structured. She began the work. The first night, she attempted a simple frequency analysis. She counted the number of times a specific cluster of intersecting lines appeared on the page. In the English language, the letter E is the most common, followed by T and they. If this was a substitution cipher, the patterns would reveal themselves through repetition. She worked for 6 hours, the fire dying down to embers, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the bedroom. She logged over 400 unique clusters. There was no repetition. The frequency was completely flat. It was a dead end. The second night, the snow began to fall, burying the moors in a suffocating white blanket. The isolation of the house became absolute. Henrietta attempted a Vigenère shift. Assuming a polyalphabetic substitution, she used the word Afghanistan as a key. Then treason. Then Vance. She covered 5 sheets of vellum with mathematical grids, mapping the jagged shapes against a rotating alphabet. The result was a string of unpronounceable consonants, another dead end. By the 4th night, the frustration began to calcify into a cold, hard obsession. The code was not fighting her. It was ignoring her. It was a locked door with no keyhole. She stopped looking at the ink as language. She started looking at the ink as a physical object. She lifted the heavy parchment to the weak light of her oil lamp and studied the reverse side of the page. The paper was deeply grooved where the pen had pressed down. Some strokes were shallow, barely skimming the surface. Other strokes were gouged into the fiber, heavy and dark. She picked up her calipers. She measured the exact distance between the heavy downward strokes. 3 millimeters, 7 millimeters, 12 millimeters. A sequence of numbers. She sat back, the chilling air biting at her cheeks. It was not a substitution cipher based on an alphabet. It was a spatial transposition based on a physical grid. The jagged lines were not letters. They were coordinates. They were drawing a map. Henrietta closed her eyes. She imagined a grid, a chessboard, a clock face. What physical object would a disgraced military commander use to anchor a cipher? A map of the battlefield? A naval chart? She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and drew a perfectly scaled map of the British military compass, 360 degrees. She overlaid the heavy strokes of the ink onto the compass points. North, southeast, west by southwest. The lines began to intersect. The intersections began to form distinct, recognizable geometric shapes. And inside those shapes, if you looked at the negative space, the blank areas where the ink did not touch, letters, hidden in the white space, protected by the violent black strokes. Her heart gave a single, violent kick against her ribs. She had found the keyhole. The decryption process was excruciatingly slow. It required her to draw the compass grid over every single cluster of lines, chart the heavy strokes, find the intersections, and isolate the negative space. It took her 3 hours to translate the first paragraph of the first page. The manor around her was completely silent, buried under 3 feet of snow. The only sound in the room was the harsh, rhythmic scratching of her graphite pencil and the ticking of a small brass clock on the mantel. The mathematics aligned. The jagged symbols translated, falling into a perfect, undeniable sequence of English letters. But the word was not artillery. The word was not assassination. The word, decoded by the finest analytical mind in London, was dragon. Henrietta stopped. She stared at the 6 letters written in her own neat, precise handwriting. She blinked, convinced that she had misaligned the compass grid. A mathematical error. She recalculated the coordinates. She redrew the shapes. The negative space remained exactly the same. Dragon. She moved to the next word. And the next. The graphite moved faster now, flying across the vellum as the complex architecture of the cipher yielded to her logic. The glass bird flew over the mountain of jagged stones, its wings catching the light of a fractured moon. The dragon sleeping below did not wake, for the bird made no sound. It was perfect and entirely fragile. Henrietta sat entirely motionless. The cold of the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a strange, disorienting heat in her chest. She translated the next paragraph. It was a continuation of the story. A detailed, beautifully written narrative about a small glass bird navigating a treacherous landscape of monsters and storms. She turned the page of the iron-bound ledger. She mapped the grid. The knight, with the broken sword, built a wall of iron around the garden. This was not a ledger of treason. This was not a record of smuggled weapons or sold-out soldiers. It was a book of fairy tales. Henrietta dropped her pencil. It rolled across the wooden desk and fell to the floor with a sharp clack. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. Her clinical detachment, the impenetrable armor she wore to survive the world, suddenly felt entirely inadequate. Lord Vance was wrong. The War Office was wrong. The terrifying monster of the moors, the butcher of the frontier, had not spent the last 3 years documenting his crimes. He had spent them writing impossible, beautiful stories and locking them behind a cipher so complex it would break the minds of military cryptographers. Why? The question hit her like a physical blow. Why encode a fairy tale? Why treat a child's story with the same paranoia as state secrets? Because to a man who believes he is a monster, innocence is the most dangerous secret of all. If the world knew he was capable of this kind of tenderness, they would find a way to use it against him. They would find a way to destroy the glass bird. Vance did not know what was in this book, but if he got his hands on it, he would use it to publicly humiliate Thorne. He would parade this vulnerability in front of the press. He would ruin the man not for his cruelty, but for his softness. Henrietta looked at the brass clock. It was 2 a.m. She could not sit in this room any longer. She needed to understand the variables. She needed to look at the locked door downstairs, the one with the bolt on the outside, and understand what this man was actually guarding. She stood up, pulling a thick woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders. She unlocked her bedroom door, the mechanism protesting with a loud metallic click. She stepped out into the freezing darkness of the second-floor hallway. The floorboards were old and warped, groaning softly under her weight. She reached the top of the main staircase and looked down into the cavernous entry hall. It was a void of pitch black, save for a single sliver of moonlight piercing through a high window. She took a breath, preparing to descend. At 2 a.m, the clinical, oppressive silence of the manor was broken by a sound that made absolutely no logical sense. It was a rhythmic, hollow thud. The distinct, uneven tapping of a wooden cane moving across the floorboards. Henrietta froze on the top step. The sound was not coming from the stairs below her. It was coming from the shadows at the far end of the second-floor corridor. Tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. The cadence was light, lacking the heavy, dragging weight of Elias Thorne's footsteps. It was someone small. She turned slowly, her hand gripping the freezing oak banister. The darkness of the hallway seemed to separate, peeling back to reveal a small figure walking steadily toward her. It was a girl, perhaps 8 years old. She wore a pristine white nightgown that brushed against the floorboards. In her right hand she held a slender, polished wooden cane, which she used to tap the wall and the floor in front of her with practiced, confident precision. The girl did not carry a candle. She did not need one. Her eyes, wide and completely unclouded, stared straight ahead into the darkness, tracking nothing. She was entirely blind. Henrietta held her breath, not wanting to startle the child. But the girl stopped 3 feet away, tilting her head slightly, like a bird, listening to the rustle of an insect underground. "You smell like graphite and cold air," the girl said. Her voice was bell-clear, ringing lightly in the gloomy corridor. It carried no fear, only intense curiosity. "You must be the woman who counts things. My uncle said you were coming. He said you have a mind like a steel trap." Henrietta stared at the child. The pieces of the impossible equation finally locked into place. The lock on the outside of the door wasn't to keep something dangerous inside. It was to prevent a blind child from wandering into the dangerous architecture of a brutalist manor house. The fairy tales weren't just stories. They were a world built entirely of words for someone who could not see. "I am Henrietta," she said, her voice dropping its usual clinical edge, softening into something she barely recognized. "I am Beatrice," the girl smiled, stepping closer and reaching out a small hand. "Are you awake because of the storm, or are you awake because you are trying to solve the puzzle of the Iron Book?" Quote. Henrietta did not offer a comforting lie. Comfort was a variable she did not trust, a soft and useless thing that usually preceded a betrayal. Both. she answered, her voice matching the quiet, unhurried cadence of the child. Beatrice took another step forward. The wooden cane swept in a precise, measured arc across the floorboards until the brass tip tapped lightly against the toe of Henrietta's leather boot. The girl stopped. She reached out with her free hand, her fingers spread wide in the freezing air. Henrietta did not pull away. She stood perfectly still as small, startlingly cold fingers brushed against her own. They did not feel the cheap, practical fabric of her skirt or the heavy wool of her shawl. They moved directly to the pads of Henrietta's right hand, tracing the hard, permanent ridges of skin. "You work," Beatrice stated. It was not a question. "The women who come here usually smell like rosewater and panic. You smell like graphite and old paper. You build things." Henrietta looked down at the unseeing eyes. She felt a sudden, sharp ache in the center of her chest, a structural weakness in her own careful armor that she had not anticipated. "I dismantle things, Beatrice. It is slightly different." A floorboard groaned. It was not a sound born of the ancient house settling in the wind. It was the sound of a massive, heavy weight shifting deliberately in the dark. Henrietta raised her head. 10 feet away, completely swallowed by the shadows of a recessed alcove, stood Elias Thorne. He had not made a sound. He had been watching them, a silent, looming violence in the dark hallway, guarding the perimeter of his fragile world. He stepped forward into the single shaft of moonlight. The pale illumination caught the jagged, violent ruin of his scarred face. He looked terrifying. He looked like a man who could snap a spine with one hand. But Henrietta was not looking at his size. She was looking at his hands. They were trembling, just slightly at his sides. It was the specific, careful terror of a man who has arranged his entire life around protecting one small person and has just watched a stranger breach the walls. "Beatrice," Thorne said. His voice was a low, grinding rumble, but the sharp edges had been deliberately filed down. "It is entirely too cold in this corridor. You should be asleep." The child turned her head toward the sound of his voice. She did not flinch. She smiled. "Miss Locke was awake. We were discussing the Iron Book. I think she is going to be very useful, Uncle Elias." Quote, "Go back to bed, little bird," he said softly. Beatrice nodded, tapping her cane against the floorboards, and navigated her way back down the dark corridor with absolute, fearless precision. Thorne waited until the latch of her bedroom door clicked shut. The silence rushed back into the hallway, heavier and colder than before. He turned his gaze back to Henrietta. The softness vanished. The monster returned to his face, a mask of cold, defensive hostility. "If you breathe a word of what you have seen to anyone," he said, the threat hanging heavy in the freezing air, "you will never leave this moor." Henrietta did not blink. She did not step back. She simply reached into the pocket of her woolen shawl and pulled out the single sheet of vellum. The glass bird flew over the mountain of jagged stones. She recited, her voice perfectly flat, perfectly clinical. Its wings catching the light of a fractured moon. The dragon sleeping below did not wake, for the bird made no sound. Quote, Thorne stopped breathing. The massive chest went completely still. "Your cipher is brilliant," Henrietta continued, stepping toward him. "A spatial transposition based on a physical grid mapped to a military compass. The negative space creates the letters. It is a masterpiece of paranoia, but it is entirely the wrong architecture for treason." She held the paper out to him. He did not take it. He stared at her, the remaining gray eye wide with a kind of horrifying realization. The fortress had fallen. The code was broken. "My study," Thorne commanded, his voice barely a whisper. "Now!" Quote, the study was located in the dead center of the ground floor, a room with no windows facing the moors. It was an interior vault of heavy oak and floor-to-ceiling books. The fireplace was cold, filled with white ash. Thorne did not light a lamp. He moved behind a massive desk and stood there in the dark, a shadow among shadows. Henrietta walked into the room, laid the translated vellum on the desk, and placed the iron-bound ledger precisely next to it. She took the leather chair opposite him, folding her hands in her lap. She was shivering, the chill of the house finally penetrating her bones, but her mind was running at a terrifying speed. "How long did it take you?" Thorne asked. The fight had drained out of him. He sounded exhausted, hollowed out by the weight of a secret he could no longer carry. 4 days to find the keyhole, Henrietta replied precisely. 3 hours to map the geometry. Once the grid is established, the translation is purely mechanical. I could read the entire book in a week. Thorne let out a long, ragged breath. He sank into the chair behind his desk, resting his elbows on the wood and burying his scarred face in his hands. It was the posture of total surrender. Lord Vance does not know what is in this book, Henrietta stated. It was a diagnostic observation, not a question. He believes it contains a confession of your alleged crimes in Afghanistan. He believes it is the evidence required to seize your assets and ruin your life. Quote. Thorne lifted his head. Julian Vance does not care about military justice, Miss Locke. He cares about land. He cares about the Ashford estate. There is a vein of coal beneath the eastern moors that is worth a kingdom. He has been trying to force me to sell for 3 years. I refused. So he acquired your ledger to blackmail you. He acquired a book he could not read, hoping it contained my ghost, Thorne corrected bitterly. If I am convicted of treason, my properties are seized by the Crown, and Vance has the inside track to purchase them at a fraction of their value. Quote. Henrietta tilted her head, calculating the angles. But the book contains fairy tales. Why not simply give him the translation? Let him see he has stolen a children's book. The blackmail evaporates. Because you do not understand the legal machinery of guardianship, Thorne said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. I am an unmarried, disgraced military officer with significant facial trauma and a reputation for violence. I am currently the sole legal guardian of a blind orphan. The courts already view this arrangement with deep suspicion. Quote, he leaned forward, his remaining eye locking onto hers. If Vance takes this book to a magistrate and reveals that the butcher of the frontier spends his nights writing obsessive, highly encrypted fairy tales about glass birds and dragons, he will not charge me with treason. He will petition the court to declare me mentally unfit, a lunatic suffering from military trauma. They will institutionalize me, Miss Locke, and they will take Beatrice away. The variables snapped into place. Henrietta saw the entire board. Vance did not need Thorne to be a traitor. He only needed Thorne to be destroyed. If the book was treason, Vance wins the estate. If the book was a delusion, Vance wins the estate, and the child is thrown into the unforgiving machinery of the state orphanage system. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. Henrietta sat in the freezing dark, listening to the wind batter the stone walls of the manor. She looked at the massive, terrifying man across the desk. He was not a monster. He was a vault, built entirely to keep a single, precious thing safe. If you tell Vance the truth, I lose my niece, Thorne said, his voice stripped of the monster, leaving only the desperate father behind. Henrietta looked at her hands. She thought of her own father, the crushing weight of the promissory notes, the smell of bergamot in Vance's office. She thought of the blind girl tapping her way fearlessly through the dark. The mathematics of the situation were absolute. If she failed, she went to a debtor's prison. If she succeeded in telling the truth, Beatrice was lost. She raised her head. The clinical detachment in her eyes sharpened into something lethal. It was not panic. It was architecture. If I lie, Henrietta replied, her voice ringing clear and hard in the quiet room, I lose my life, so we are going to build him a lie he can legally choke on. Thorne stared at her. What are you talking about? Quote, Vance expects me to deliver a translated document proving your guilt, Henrietta said, her mind already assembling the pieces. He intends to present my translation, along with the ledger, to a magistrate. Under the Evidence Act, a translated cipher presented by a sworn expert becomes public record the moment the magistrate signs it. Quote, Yes, Thorne said slowly, tracking her logic, which ruins me. It ruins whoever the cipher incriminates, Henrietta corrected. She stood up, walking to the desk and placing her hand flat on the heavy iron cover of the ledger. You wrote this cipher, Elias. You created the geometry, which means you can write it backward. Thorne stood up as well. The air in the room seemed to shift, the atmospheric pressure dropping as he realized what she was suggesting. You want to forge a new entry. You want to overwrite the ledger. Not overwrite, Henrietta said. We are going to add an appendix, a final chapter, written in your exact hand, using your exact encryption. When I return to London, I will hand Vance the translation of that specific chapter. He will take it to the magistrate, blind with his own arrogance, and he will demand the magistrate read it into the public record to secure his prize. And what exactly will the magistrate be reading? Thorne asked, his voice rough with sudden, sharp anticipation. Henrietta offered a smile that contained absolutely no warmth. 3 years ago, before my father died, I earned my living translating foreign banking ledgers for the shipping guilds. I possess an eidetic memory for numbers, Elias. It is a curse, usually. But I remember the accounts of a subsidiary company in Calais, a company that was quietly embezzling crown funds. Thorne's eyes widened. Vance. Vance, Henrietta confirmed. We are going to encode Lord Julian Vance's secret bank routing numbers, dates of transfer, and the exact sums of stolen crown money into the back of your fairy tale. And we are going to let him deliver his own execution warrant directly to the authorities. They had exactly 14 days before the snow was scheduled to break and the roads to London became passable. 14 days to reverse engineer an impossibly complex cipher, forge a document that could withstand legal scrutiny, and bind it seamlessly into an iron-locked book. The study became a war room. The fire was kept roaring at all hours, burning through massive oak logs that Thorne hauled in from the courtyard. The temperature in the room finally rose, melting the frost off the interior windows. Henrietta commandeered the massive mahogany desk. She covered every square inch of the surface with her instruments, mapping out the architecture of the trap. It was a grueling, agonizing process. Writing the cipher forward was infinitely harder than breaking it backward. Henrietta had to dictate the exact legal phrasing of the financial confession, translate the letters into coordinates on the military compass grid, and then calculate the negative space. She would pass the mathematical grid to Thorne, who sat beside her, his massive frame hunched over the vellum. He had to draw the heavy, jagged strokes with absolute precision. A single millimeter of error, a single slip of the pen, would destroy the geometry of the negative space and render the letter illegible. They worked in shifts. 3 hours on, 1 hour of rest. The manor was completely silent around them, cut off from the rest of the world by a 10-foot drift of snow that had buried the iron gates. By the 5th day, the formal titles vanished. She was no longer Miss Locke. He was no longer Major Thorne. They were simply Henrietta and Elias, two highly intelligent people locked in a closed system, operating on the same frequency. The routing number is 4492, Henrietta said, rubbing her temples. Her fingers were stained permanently black with graphite. Her eyes burned from staring at the lamplight. Elias dipped his pen into the inkwell. He did not look at the paper. He looked at her. He noticed the dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. He noticed the way she chewed on the inside of her cheek when the mathematics refused to align. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who were either terrified of his face or trying to use his reputation for their own gain. Henrietta Locke did neither. She treated his mind as an equal, and she treated his physical presence as an immovable, comforting fact. He set the pen down. "Drink your tea, Henrietta. It has been sitting there for 20 minutes. She blinked, pulling herself out of the numerical trance. She looked at the teacup resting near her elbow. It was still steaming. Elias had quietly refreshed it while she was calculating the grid for the number 9. "I cannot lose the sequence," she murmured, picking up the cup. Her hands were shaking slightly from the sheer mental exertion. Elias reached across the desk. He did not hesitate. He placed his large, scarred hand gently over hers, steadying the porcelain cup. The contrast was startling. His hand a landscape of violent history, hers pale and stained with ink. The heat of his skin transferred through the ceramic, traveling up her arm and settling somewhere deep in her chest. "The sequence will hold," he said quietly, his thumb brushing lightly against her knuckle. "You have built the walls too well for them to fall now. Drink!" Henrietta took a breath. The clinical detachment, the shield she had worn since her father's death, cracked right down the middle. She looked at the man sitting beside her. She saw the quiet, steady father who wrote stories in the dark. She saw the soldier who was willing to destroy his own name to keep a child safe. She took a sip of the tea. It was perfectly steeped. "If we miscalculate the spatial transposition on the ledger page," she said softly, not pulling her hand away from his, "the ink will overlap the original binding. Vance will see the forgery. Then we will not miscalculate, Elias replied. He withdrew his hand slowly, leaving her skin feeling strangely cold in his absence. Give me the coordinates for the number 4. By the 12th day, the physical toll was visible on both of them. They moved with the slow, deliberate care of deep-sea divers operating under crushing pressure. But the work was flawless. 6 pages of dense, jagged, violent ink had been added to the back of the ledger. To the untrained eye, it looked exactly like the manic scribblings of a broken mind. To the magistrate holding Henrietta's translation key, it would read as a perfectly formatted, legally binding ledger of Julian Vance's international financial treason. They unbound the iron covers of the book. It took Elias an hour of sweating, physical labor to bend the brass rivets back into place using a set of heavy iron pliers. He had to age the fresh pages, exposing them to the smoke of the chimney and rubbing the edges with a mixture of ash and tea leaves, so they matched the worn, yellowed texture of the original vellum. On the night of the 13th day it was finished. The ledger sat in the center of the desk, looking exactly as it had when Vance slid it across his polished mahogany table in London. It was heavy. It was dangerous. It was a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. Henrietta stood by the fire, wiping the ash from her hands with a damp cloth. She felt a profound, exhausting sense of victory. She had not just solved the puzzle. She had weaponized it. Elias stood up from the desk. He walked over to the fire and stood beside her. The physical proximity between them was no longer a matter of necessity. It was a matter of gravity. They naturally drifted toward each other in the room. "You have saved her," Elias said. The rumble of his voice was so quiet it was almost lost to the crackle of the burning wood. "You have saved us both." Henrietta looked up at him. The firelight cast dancing shadows over his scars. Turning them into a map she suddenly wanted to trace with her fingers. "We have engineered a probability, Elias. We do not have certainty until Vance reads the document to the magistrate." "It will work," he said, turning his body fully toward hers. He looked down at her, his pale gray eye stripping away the last remnants of her armor. "Because you built it, and you do not make structural errors." Quote. He raised his hand. For a terrifying, electrifying second, Henrietta thought he was going to touch her face. She stopped breathing. The air between them pulled taut, vibrating with the slow-burn friction of 2 heavily guarded people finally realizing they were safe. A sound shattered the silence. It was not a floorboard. It was not the wind. It was the frantic, high-pitched barking of the estate hounds outside the front gates. Henrietta spun toward the heavy oak door of the study. The romantic tension vanished instantly, replaced by a spike of pure, freezing adrenaline. Elias moved instantly, his military reflexes taking over. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, pulling the heavy velvet curtains back from the narrow interior window that looked out toward the front courtyard. "The snow," Elias hissed, his voice dropping into a lethal register. "The storm broke early on the lower elevation. The road is clear." Henrietta rushed to his side. Through the frosted glass, she could see the heavy iron gates of Ashford Manor being pushed open by 3 men in heavy winter coats. Behind them, a dark, enclosed carriage was fighting its way through the snowdrifts, its wheels crunching violently against the ice. They were a day early. The deadline was tomorrow. He did not wait, Henrietta realized, the mathematics of the situation recalculating in her head with terrifying speed. He knows the snow is clearing. He wants to trap me before I have a chance to secure independent transport. Quote, "Is the ink completely dry?" Elias demanded, turning back to the desk. Henrietta's heart slammed against her ribs. She looked at the iron-bound ledger. "The cipher is dry, but the ash and tea mixture on the edges. If he touches the pages immediately, they will feel damp. He is paranoid, Elias. If he feels damp paper inside a sealed book, he will know it was opened." Quote, "Then he does not touch the pages," Elias said. He grabbed the ledger off the desk, his knuckles turning white. "He only touches the translation." A heavy, booming knock echoed through the cavernous entry hall. It was the sound of a fist hammering against the oak front doors. It was authoritative. It was impatient. Henrietta grabbed her translation notes, the genuine pages decoding the fairy tale, and the forged pages containing Vance's financial ruin. She shoved the genuine pages into the roaring fire. watching the story of the glass bird curl into black ash in seconds. She kept only the weapon. "Miss Locke," a voice echoed from the hallway. It was smooth, frictionless, and completely devoid of warmth. Lord Julian Vance had not waited for the servant to open the door. He had let himself in. "I trust the country air has been conducive to your work." Elias looked at Henrietta. The monster mask slid perfectly back over his features. The scars seemed to pull tight, his posture straightening into the terrifying, imposing silhouette of the butcher of the frontier. "Stay behind me," Elias ordered quietly. "No," Henrietta said, her clinical voice returning, cold and sharp as a scalpel. She picked up the forged translation. "He bought my debt. He expects a terrified employee. If you hand it to him, he will suspect a trap. I must deliver the execution." She walked to the heavy study door, turned the brass knob, and stepped out into the freezing hallway. Lord Vance stood in the center of the slate floor, brushing snow from the shoulders of his immaculate vicuña overcoat. He looked entirely out of place in the brutalist architecture of the manor, a creature of London drawing rooms and quiet blackmail. But he was not alone. Standing beside him, looking extremely uncomfortable in the freezing Yorkshire air, was a man wearing the heavy black robes of a crown magistrate. Vance smiled, a predatory twitch at the corner of his mouth. He looked at Henrietta, and then his eyes drifted to the massive, shadowed figure of Elias Thorne, stepping out of the study behind her. "Major Thorne," Vance said softly, the victory already ringing in his tone. "I apologize for the intrusion, but the roads have cleared, and justice is a matter of strict timetables. Miss Locke, do you have the translation, or do I hand your promissory notes to the magistrate?" Quote, Henrietta looked at the ledger in Elias's hands. She looked at the magistrate. The trap was set. The jaws were open. But if Vance asked to inspect the book before the magistrate read the translation, the damp edges would give them away, and she would go to prison before the sun went down. "I have it, Lord Vance," Henrietta said. She stepped forward, holding the forged papers out into the cold, empty air between them. Lord Julian Vance's hand hovered in the freezing air of the entry hall. He did not look at the thick stack of translated vellum Henrietta was offering him. His eyes, dark and entirely devoid of warmth, were fixed on the heavy iron-bound ledger held in the massive, scarred grip of Elias Thorne. The leather of the book was warped. The brass rivets were scratched, and the edges of the freshly bound pages at the back were still faintly, imperceptibly damp with the ash and tea mixture Elias had applied to age them. If Vance touched that ledger now, the moisture would transfer to the immaculate gray leather of his gloves. The illusion would instantly collapse. The forensic reality of the forgery would be exposed before the magistrate even crossed the threshold. Henrietta did not pull the translated pages back. She held them perfectly still in the dead space between them. Her pulse was a frantic, uneven drumbeat against her collarbone, but her hands were the hands of a surgeon. She knew exactly how to dismantle arrogant men. You do not give them what they want. You give them protocol. She turned her gaze away from Vance, dismissing him entirely, and looked directly at the Crown Magistrate. The man was shivering violently. His heavy black robes offered absolutely no architectural defense against the punishing Yorkshire draft, tearing through the open front doors. His nose was bright red. He looked miserable. He looked like a man who desperately wanted to be sitting by a fire with a glass of brandy. This was the structural weakness in Vance's attack. The magistrate was not a co-conspirator. He was an unwitting, bureaucratic tool, dragged into a blizzard to rubber-stamp a legal formality. Henrietta weaponized his discomfort. She spoke with the absolute, freezing authority of a War Office cryptographer. She stated that under the Evidence Act of 1851, a translated cipher must be sworn into the public record by the presiding legal officer before the physical artifact could be handled by the accusing party. To do otherwise broke the chain of custody. To do otherwise rendered the evidence inadmissible in a court of law. The magistrate blinked behind his wire-rimmed spectacles. He was cold. He was tired. He agreed with her immediately. Vance's jaw tightened, the muscle feathered just beneath his cheekbone. He had expected resistance, perhaps tears, perhaps a physical altercation he could use to prove Thorne's inherent violence. He did not expect a young woman in a plain wool skirt to quote parliamentary evidence laws in a freezing hallway. Elias did not say a word. He did not need to. He simply turned his massive frame and gestured down the dark corridor toward the drawing room, the room with the roaring fire, the room with the heavy iron lock mounted on the outside of the door. The procession moved in silence. The air in the drawing room was a sudden, oppressive wall of heat. Elias walked directly to the heavy mahogany center table. He placed the iron-bound ledger down. The brass hit the wood with a heavy, final thud that seemed to echo in the floorboards. Then he stepped backward, crossing his arms over his immense chest, positioning his body exactly between the ledger and Julian Vance. The magistrate took the wing-back chair nearest the hearth. He rubbed his numb hands together, pulling a pair of reading glasses from the deep pockets of his robes. He hooked them over his ears and gestured impatiently for Henrietta to hand over the translated pages. She walked across the Persian rug. Every step felt like walking on a wire suspended over a canyon. If she fell now, she would take Thorne and the blind child with her. She handed the thick stack of vellum to the magistrate. The room went entirely silent. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the violent crackle of the oak logs. The magistrate cleared his throat. The sound was wet and frail. He looked down at the paper. He began to read Henrietta's neat, precise handwriting, the handwriting of a woman who had spent years translating foreign shipping manifests for men who never bothered to learn her name. The first paragraph was a masterpiece of fabricated paranoia. Henrietta had written it to sound exactly like the man standing guard at the table. It spoke of the Afghan frontier. It spoke of the bitter, blinding cold of the mountains. It spoke of the crushing, impossible weight of command. Vance stood near the frosted window, his back perfectly straight. He was not looking at the magistrate. He was looking at Elias. The predatory, satisfied smile had returned to his face. He was drinking in the sight of the butcher of the frontier being legally dismantled in his own ancestral home. This was the ghost he had paid for. This was the ruin he had orchestrated. He believed the massive estate, the house, and the vein of coal resting beneath the frozen moors were already sitting safely in his portfolio. Henrietta watched Vance. She did not look away. She wanted to see the exact moment the poison hit his bloodstream. The magistrate turned the first page. The dry rasp of the vellum sounded like a blade being drawn from a scabbard. He read the second paragraph. He read the third. The bureaucratic fog of the legal language filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Then a sound broke the tension. It did not come from the men in the room. It came from the ceiling directly above them. Tap, pause, tap. The distinct, uneven cadence of a wooden cane moving across the second-floor floorboards. Beatrice was awake. The blind girl was navigating the dark, unaware that the monsters she was protected from were currently sitting in her living room. Elias's posture shifted. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the shoulders. But Henrietta saw it. The stakes were suddenly regrounded, dragged out of the abstract realm of legal documents and placed firmly in the physical world. If this trap failed, the little girl tapping her way down the hall would be thrown into the grinding machinery of the state orphanage system. The magistrate reached the final chapter, the appendix. The 6 pages Henrietta and Elias had forged in the dead of night. The rhythm of the reading changed. The magistrate slowed down. He stumbled over a word. He frowned, pushing his spectacles higher up the bridge of his nose, leaning closer to the firelight to examine the text. He read a string of coordinates. Then he read a date, October the 14th, 1879. The date meant absolutely nothing to Elias Thorne. It meant nothing to the magistrate. But it was the exact day Julian Vance had acquired his first major shipping fleet using funds quietly embezzled from the Crown's naval treasury. Vance's smile stopped. It did not fade. It simply froze in place, locked by a sudden, paralyzing shock of recognition. The magistrate read the next line. It was a sum of money. 42,000 pounds sterling. Vance's head snapped toward the fire. The effortless, frictionless grace of the London aristocrat vanished entirely. His posture went rigid. The vicuña coat suddenly looked too heavy for his frame. The magistrate continued. The words were entirely devoid of emotion, a dry recitation of catastrophic facts. He read a routing number, 44922. Vance smiled as the magistrate read the translated text. He stopped smiling when the magistrate read his own bank account numbers aloud. He did not shout. He did not curse. He went completely, terrifyingly silent. The color drained from his face with sickening speed, leaving his skin the color of old, wet parchment. He stared at the magistrate, his eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating panic. The air in the room seemed to turn to glass, fragile and ready to shatter. The magistrate was oblivious to the psychological execution happening 10 feet away from him. He was just reading words on a page, fulfilling his mandate. He read the name of the bank in Calais. He read the exact, convoluted corporate structure of the shell company Vance used to launder the stolen money. Henrietta's memory was absolute. It was a curse, usually. A mind that could not let go of the numbers it consumed. She had translated those specific banking ledgers 3 years ago. She had recognized the patterns of theft then, but had no power to act. She had locked those numbers in the dark vault of her mind, a piece of useless trivia, until this exact moment. Now she was feeding them directly into the jaws of the British legal system, using Vance's own arrogance as the delivery mechanism. Vance realized what was happening. The mathematics clicked into place in his mind. He looked at the girl standing quietly by the door, the codebreaker. She hadn't just solved Thorne's cipher. She had weaponized it. She had written her own. He lunged forward. He did not care about protocol. He did not care about the magistrate's presence. He reached violently across the mahogany table, his manicured hands desperate to snatch the translated pages out of the legal officer's hands and throw them into the fire. He never even got close. Elias moved. It was not the movement of a broken, traumatized man. It was the movement of an apex predator that had been waiting patiently in the tall grass for 3 years. A massive, scarred hand clamped down on Vance's wrist. The sound of the impact was wet and heavy, a brutal slap of flesh against bone. Elias did not squeeze hard enough to break the joint, but the threat was implicitly written in the horrifying, immovable pressure of his grip. He stopped Vance's forward momentum entirely, pitting the aristocrat's arm flat against the wood of the table. Vance gasped, a sharp, ragged sound of pain shooting up into his shoulder. He looked up, terrified, into the face of Elias Thorne. The scarred, ruined face was completely calm. The pale gray eye was devoid of anger. It was filled with the cold, absolute certainty of a man who has just slammed a steel door shut on a tomb. The magistrate dropped the vellum pages. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the slate floorboards. He looked at Vance, panting and trapped against the table, then at Thorne, then down at the papers resting near the fire. The bureaucratic fog had finally lifted from his brain. He was a sworn servant of the Crown, and he had just read a highly detailed, numerically perfect confession of international financial treason. But the confession was not Thorne's. The magistrate looked at Vance. The aristocrat was trembling now, a fine, uncontrollable vibration running through his trapped arm. "Lord Vance!" the magistrate spoke. His voice was no longer frail. It was sharp with the terrifying weight of the British Empire. "Would you care to explain why your personal banking details, including a highly classified War Office transit account, are embedded in a coded ledger that you yourself provided to this court?" Quote, "The room held its breath. The grandfather clock ticked. Henrietta watched. She felt a profound, exhausting wave of satisfaction wash over her. The trap was sprung. The jaws were locked. The geometry of the room had fundamentally changed. Vance was no longer the hunter. He was the prey, pinned under the glass for observation. Vance opened his mouth. He tried to summon the smooth, frictionless voice that had destroyed dozens of lives in quiet London offices. He tried to invent a lie, but there was no lie large enough to cover the precision of those numbers. He was an architect of blackmail, and he recognized immediately when he had been out-engineered. He looked at Henrietta. The pure, unadulterated hatred in his eyes was startling. It was the look of a drowning man desperately searching for an anchor to drag down into the dark with him. With his free left hand, Vance reached into the inner pocket of his heavy vicuña coat. He pulled out a thick, folded envelope. It was sealed with dark red wax. Henrietta felt the blood freeze in her veins. She knew exactly what was inside that envelope. It was the sheaf of promissory notes, The debts her father had forged in a drunken panic. The paper chain that made her Vance's literal property. Vance's voice was a harsh, broken hiss. He looked at the magistrate, pointing a trembling finger at Henrietta. "The translation is a forgery!" Vance spat, the aristocratic veneer completely shattered. "That woman is a desperate debtor. She is entirely financially compromised. She fabricated this translation to escape her obligations to me, and she colluded with this madman to do it." He threw the envelope onto the table, just out of Elias's reach. "Open it! Look at the signatures!" Quote. The magistrate looked at the envelope. He looked at Henrietta. The balance of the room shifted violently, the floor dropping out from beneath them. The ticking of the clock seemed to double in volume. Vance was bleeding out legally, but he was going to ensure Henrietta went to prison right alongside him. He demanded the magistrate examine the promissory notes immediately. He demanded Miss Locke's arrest for fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. Henrietta stood perfectly still. Her mind raced, calculating the variables at lightning speed. If the magistrate opened that envelope, her father's crimes became public record. She would be ruined. The translation would immediately be thrown out as the work of a compromised, untrustworthy agent. Vance might still face a long investigation, but he would have destroyed her first. And worse, if her translation was thrown out, Thorne's original ledger remained a mystery. Vance's lawyers would tear it apart. Beatrice would be taken. The entire structure she had spent 2 weeks building was collapsing. She took a breath. She prepared to speak. She prepared to sacrifice herself entirely, to confess to the forgery, but swear Thorne had no part in it, hoping the lie would be enough to keep the child safe. But Elias Thorne did not let her speak. He released Vance's wrist, shoving the man backward with contemptuous force. Vance stumbled, crashing into a bookshelf. Elias reached across the mahogany table. His massive, ink-stained hand picked up the sealed envelope, containing Henrietta's ruin. Vance sneered, rubbing his bruised wrist. "Do not touch my property, Thorne. That is legal evidence." Elias did not look at Vance. He did not look at the magistrate. He looked across the room at Henrietta. The pale gray eye that had been so cold, so terrifying a moment ago, was now filled with a specific, careful tenderness. It was the look of a man who had spent 3 years building walls to keep the world out, only to realize his fortress was finally large enough to protect someone else. Elias turned to the magistrate. His voice was a low, grinding rumble that seemed to vibrate the glass in the window panes. "There is no debt," Elias stated calmly. "Lord Vance is mistaken." Vance laughed. It was a desperate, hysterical, ugly sound. "Are you blind as well as mad? Tell him to open the envelope, magistrate. The proof of her ruin is right there in ink." Quote. Elias turned his hand over. He held the thick envelope directly above the roaring, spitting flames of the fireplace. Vance screamed. He lunged forward again, his hands clawing at the empty air. Elias dropped the envelope. The fire caught the paper instantly. The dark red wax melted, hissing violently as it hit the white-hot oak logs. The dry, yellowed paper of the promissory notes ignited with a bright, blinding flash. The forged signatures, the crushing, inescapable weight of Henrietta's past, the iron chain that had bound her to a life of clinical fear and isolation, all of it turned to black, floating ash in less than 3 seconds. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the crackle of the flames consuming the very last piece of Julian Vance's leverage. The magistrate stared at the fire, his mouth slightly open, stunned by the sudden, brazen destruction of evidence. He slowly turned his head to look at the massive military commander. Elias Thorne did not flinch. He looked at the magistrate and offered a faint, unapologetic shrug. "My apologies, magistrate." My hand slipped. "A tragic, lingering result of my war injuries. I am quite clumsy today." The competence, the sheer, terrifying audacity of the lie hung in the air. The magistrate looked at the ruined, scarred face of the man who had supposedly just destroyed vital evidence. Then he looked down at the translation on the floor. The document that proved the aristocrat bleeding in the corner was actively stealing from the British Navy. The magistrate made a choice. He decided he had not seen an envelope burn. He decided he had only seen a traitor. "Lord Vance," the magistrate said. his voice dropping an octave, heavy with the full weight of the law. "You will accompany me back to the carriage immediately. We are returning to London. I suggest you spend the journey considering your defense, as the Crown auditors will be waiting at your townhouse before midnight." The annihilation was absolute. It took 10 minutes to force Vance out of the house. The aristocrat did not speak again. The shock had finally paralyzed his vocal cords. He moved like an automaton, his eyes wide and hollow, guided by the firm grip of the magistrate's hired men. The heavy oak doors of Ashford Manor slammed shut. The iron bolts slid into place. Outside, the sound of the carriage wheels ground against the ice, growing fainter and fainter until the howling wind swallowed them entirely. The silence that rushed back into the cavernous entry hall was staggering. It was not the oppressive, holding its breath silence that had greeted Henrietta when she first arrived. It was the profound, ringing silence of a battlefield after the artillery has finally stopped firing. Henrietta stood near the entrance to the drawing room. The adrenaline that had kept her spine perfectly straight for the last hour suddenly evaporated, leaving her hollowed out and trembling. Her knees buckled slightly. She reached out, catching the edge of the stone archway to steady herself. Elias was there before she could fall. He didn't grab her with the desperate, bruising force he had used on Vance. He moved with the quiet, deliberate care of a man handling spun glass. His large hands caught her by the shoulders, steadying her weight, offering a physical anchor in a world that had suddenly stopped spinning. "It's over," Elias said softly. The grinding stones in his voice had smoothed out completely. "He is gone. You are safe." Henrietta looked up into his face. The firelight from the drawing room spilled into the dark hall, painting his scars in warm gold. The clinical detachment, the impenetrable intellectual armor she wore to survive the world, was completely gone. She had no debt. She had no master. She was entirely free, and she was terrified. Because freedom meant she had no contract binding her to this house. Freedom meant the mathematics were solved, the puzzle was broken, and she had absolutely no logical reason to stay in Yorkshire. She stepped back, pulling gently out of his grip. The loss of his heat was immediate and sharp. She smoothed the front of her charcoal gray skirt, her hands shaking slightly. She forced the clinical mask back over her features, though it felt heavy and ill-fitting now. "The contract is fulfilled," Henrietta said, her voice tight, trying to find the familiar comfort of professional boundaries. "The library is appraised. The ledger is secure. I will pack my instruments. I can hire a coach from the village tomorrow morning." Elias stood perfectly still. He looked at her, his pale gray eye taking in the defensive posture, the way she folded her arms across her chest to protect herself from a threat that was no longer there. He understood exactly what she was doing. He had spent 3 years doing the exact same thing. He did not let her retreat. He stepped forward, crossing the distance she had just created, invading her carefully constructed perimeter. He loomed over her, a massive shadow in the dim hall, but there was no violence in his frame. "Henrietta," he said, and the way he spoke her name made her breath catch in her throat. He reached out. This time, he did not touch her hands or her shoulders. He reached up, his ink-stained fingers brushing lightly against her cheek, a touch so devastatingly soft it made her eyes burn. "You spent 2 weeks breaking my codes," Elias murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, mapping the coordinates of her face. "You dismantled every wall I built. Do you honestly believe I am going to let you walk out of this fortress now?" Quote. Henrietta did not breathe. The air in the corridor was entirely motionless, trapped in the second between Elias Thorne's question and the inevitable collapse of her remaining defenses. His thumb rested against her jawline, calloused and impossibly warm against her freezing skin. She had spent her entire adult life calculating the exact distance required to keep human beings from becoming variables in her existence. She had built a fortress of graphite and numbers. Now, the monster of the moors was standing inside the gates, and he had not broken them down. He had simply waited for her to open them. She looked up at his face. The jagged white lines of the shrapnel scars caught the ambient glow of the drawing-room fire. They did not look like violence anymore. They looked like the topography of a country she desperately wanted to navigate. "I do not know how to stay," she whispered. The clinical precision of her voice was completely fractured. It sounded raw, stripped of its armor. I only know how to dismantle things. I only know how to survive. Elias lowered his head. His massive frame blocked out the darkness of the entry hall entirely, leaving her with nothing but the heat radiating from his chest and the sharp, clean scent of cold air and oak smoke. "Then you will learn a new mathematics," he said quietly. A floorboard groaned above them. It was not the heavy, settling weight of the brutalist stone manor. It was the distinct, uneven tapping of a wooden cane. Henrietta flinched, the spell shattering instantly. Elias dropped his hand, taking a half-step backward, the protective perimeter instantly re-establishing itself in his posture. He turned his head toward the massive, curved staircase, sweeping up into the pitch black of the second floor. Beatrice stood 3 steps from the bottom. She looked impossibly small against the cavernous architecture of the hall, her white nightgown catching the weak light. Her unseeing eyes were wide, tracking the subtle shifts in the atmospheric pressure of the room below. "The monsters are gone," the child stated. It was not a question. It was a diagnostic observation, delivered with the absolute, fearless certainty of a girl who had never been taught to panic. Elias let out a breath that sounded like a physical weight dropping to the slate floor. He walked toward the stairs, his limp slightly more pronounced now that the adrenaline was bleeding out of his system. He stopped at the bottom step and looked up at his niece. "How did you know there were monsters in the house, little bird?" he asked, his voice returning to the gentle, grinding rumble he reserved exclusively for her. Beatrice descended the final 3 steps, her cane finding the slate with a sharp clack. She walked straight past her uncle and stopped directly in front of Henrietta. "Because the house felt like iron," Beatrice said, tilting her head. And because Miss Locke stopped counting the clock ticks in her head, Henrietta stared down at the blind girl. The sheer, terrifying perception of the child bypassed logic entirely. "They're gone, Beatrice," Henrietta said, ensuring her voice was perfectly level, devoid of the tremor that was currently vibrating through her hands. "The iron book is closed. The man who wanted to take it has been locked out of the geometry." Beatrice reached out. Her small, incredibly cold fingers found Henrietta's wrist, bypassing the sleeve of her charcoal wool dress to press directly against her pulse. "Your heart is beating entirely too fast for a woman who has solved the puzzle," Beatrice noted, a small, knowing smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. Elias stepped forward, his massive shadow enveloping them both. "It is late," he said, resting his hand gently on the crown of the child's head. "The storm has passed the elevation, but the temperature is dropping. We are going to the drawing room. The fire is still burning." He did not issue it as a command. It was an invitation to a sanctuary. Henrietta did not calculate the variables. She did not map the exits. She simply followed them. The drawing room was an oven of heat and the smell of burnt wax. The massive oak logs on the hearth had collapsed into a glowing, white-hot ruin, radiating a primal warmth that finally began to thaw the marrow of Henrietta's bones. She stood near the Persian rug, looking at the exact spot where Julian Vance had stood 20 minutes ago. The air still felt slightly bruised from the confrontation. Elias guided Beatrice to the heavy wingback chair. He pulled a thick woolen blanket from the back of the sofa and draped it over the child's shoulders, tucking the edges in with practiced, military efficiency. He then turned his attention to the mahogany table. The iron-bound ledger sat exactly where he had dropped it. Next to it, scattered across the polished wood, were the ashes of the forged translation and the faint, charred remnants of Henrietta's promissory notes. The physical evidence of her debt was nothing but carbon dust. Elias did not look at the ashes. He looked at Henrietta's hands. "Your fingers are stained," he observed quietly. Henrietta looked down. Her fingertips were permanently black from hours of grinding graphite into vellum. The ink from the cipher had worked its way under her fingernails, a physical manifestation of the violence they had just engineered. "It will not wash out," she said defensively, crossing her arms. "It never does. It is the occupational hazard of my profession. Sit down, Henrietta." She blinked, the sharp, unexpected command cutting through her exhaustion. She looked at him, searching for the monster, but found only the quiet, immovable father. She sat down on the edge of the velvet sofa, her posture still rigidly upright. Elias walked out of the drawing room. He returned 3 minutes later, carrying a heavy porcelain basin filled with steaming water, a rough linen cloth draped over his shoulder, and a small bar of lye soap. He set the basin down on the low table directly in front of her knees. He did not ask for permission. He simply knelt on the Persian rug, a man who had commanded battalions folding his massive frame onto the floor. He reached out and took her right hand. Henrietta inhaled sharply. The contrast was blinding. The water in the basin was scalding hot, the steam rising in thick plumes, but his grip was entirely steady. He submerged her hand into the water. The heat was a physical shock. It bit into her skin, rushing up her arm and flooding her chest with a sudden, overwhelming lethargy. The adrenaline that had kept her upright for 14 days finally began to crash. Elias took the rough linen cloth, dipped it into the water, and rubbed the lye soap into the fibers. He began to scrub her fingers. He did not work gently. He worked meticulously. He traced the lines of her knuckles, applying deliberate, heavy pressure to the calluses built by years of holding drafting pencils. The friction of the cloth against her skin was a grounding wire, pulling her erratic, racing thoughts down into the physical present. She watched his face. He was entirely focused on the task, his jaw tense, the jagged scars pulling tight against his cheekbone. He was treating her hands with the same reverent, terrifying attention he applied to his ciphers. "I have spent 3 years assuming every stranger who approached this house was an assassin," Elias murmured, his thumb moving over the back of her hand, rubbing away a streak of black ink. "I built a perimeter of horror. I let the villagers tell stories about the monster on the moors. I let the War Office believe I was a broken, violent animal. It was the only architecture that kept Beatrice entirely invisible." He rinsed the cloth in the steaming water. The basin turned a murky, charcoal gray. "When Vance sent you, I calculated the threat," Elias continued, moving to her left hand. "I saw a codebreaker, a mercenary of logic. I expected you to panic when you saw my face. I expected you to freeze when the temperature dropped. You did neither." He lifted his head, his pale gray eye locking onto hers. The intensity in his gaze was suffocating. "You looked at my scars and diagnosed the trajectory of the shrapnel. You looked at the outside lock on the door and deduced the blindness of the child. You looked at a wall of jagged ink that had broken the minds of military cryptographers, and you found a glass bird hiding in the negative space." Elias dropped the cloth into the water. He took her clean, red, perfectly warm hands in his massive grip. "You are not an archivist, Henrietta. You are a demolition expert, and I am entirely at your mercy." The words hung in the suffocating heat of the drawing room. It was an absolute surrender. The butcher of the frontier, the man who had terrified the British military establishment, was kneeling on a rug, offering her the keys to his fortress. Henrietta felt a sudden, violent pressure behind her eyes. The tears she had refused to shed when her father died, the tears she had swallowed when Vance threatened her with prison, finally broke through the surface. She did not sob. A single, silent drop traced its way down her cheek, a physical manifestation of the ice cracking inside her chest. Elias reached up. He caught the tear with the pad of his thumb before it could fall. He did not say a word. He did not offer empty, meaningless platitudes. He simply held her hands, anchoring her in the quiet safety of the room, while the last remnants of the storm battered the stone walls outside. On the chair across from them, Beatrice had fallen fast asleep, the woolen blanket pulled up to her chin, her breathing a slow, even rhythm. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 4 times. The night was over. The trap had closed. And for the first time in her 27 years, Henrietta Locke did not feel the need to calculate the nearest exit. The light that woke her was not the weak, bruised illumination of a Yorkshire winter. It was a blinding, absolute white. Henrietta opened her eyes. She was lying in the bedchamber, in the west wing, the mattress stuffed with horsehair, suddenly feeling entirely different underneath her. She sat up, the heavy quilt pooling around her waist. The fire had died down to embers, but the room was not freezing. The atmospheric pressure of the house had fundamentally shifted. She pushed the blankets aside, ignoring the sudden shock of the cold floorboards against her bare feet, and walked to the narrow, leaded window. She pressed her hand against the frosted glass and rubbed away the condensation. The storm had broken. The sky was a violent, impossible blue, entirely devoid of clouds. The moors, stretching out to the horizon in every direction, were buried under 4 feet of pristine, glittering snow. The brutalist architecture of the landscape had been softened, the sharp edges of the rocks and the twisting branches of the dead oaks completely covered in a thick, immaculate blanket. It was breathtaking. It was a landscape wiped entirely clean. Henrietta dressed quickly, pulling on a fresh wool skirt and a heavy cotton blouse. She did not reach for her calipers. She did not reach for her graphite pencils. The instruments sat on the wooden desk, entirely useless to her now. The mathematics were solved. She opened the door to the corridor. The house was utterly silent, but it was no longer holding its breath. It felt expansive. It felt like a space that could actually be inhabited, rather than merely survived. She descended the main staircase, her hand trailing along the freezing oak banister. The entry hall was flooded with geometric shafts of morning sunlight pouring through the high windows. The drawing room was empty. The iron-bound ledger was gone from the mahogany table. Henrietta walked toward the kitchens, following the faint scent of roasted oats and strong tea. She found Mrs. Dobbs, the elderly housekeeper, who had communicated almost entirely through terrified grunts for the past 2 weeks, humming quietly while stirring a massive iron pot over the stove. "Good morning, Miss Locke," Mrs. Dobbs said, turning around with a warm, completely uncharacteristic smile. The Major requested, "I keep a plate warm for you. He and the little miss have gone to the East Wing." Henrietta froze. The words triggered a sudden, sharp spike of curiosity. The East Wing. The forbidden territory. The corridor Elias had warned her away from on her very first night. The place she had been contracted to appraise, which was nothing more than a cover story for Vance's blackmail. She had never set foot past the heavy iron double doors at the end of the main hall. "Why are they in the East Wing?" Henrietta asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Mrs. Dobbs chuckled, wiping her hands on a linen apron. "The Major spends all his mornings there when the weather traps us inside. It is his workshop, miss. A workshop." Henrietta did not wait for the tea. She turned and walked back through the cavernous manor, her boots clicking a rapid, determined rhythm against the slate floors. She bypassed the drawing room. She bypassed the study. She reached the end of the long, dark corridor where the iron double doors stood entirely shut. They were not locked. There was no heavy bolt on the outside. There was no keyhole. They were simply pushed closed. Henrietta placed her hands flat against the cold metal and pushed. The hinges, heavy and perfectly balanced, swung open without a single sound. The breath left her lungs instantly. She had expected a damp, useless library. She had expected an armory, or a room filled with the grim trophies of a military campaign. She stepped into a cathedral of light and wood. The East Wing was not a series of rooms. It was one massive, cavernous space. The exterior wall was entirely constructed of floor-to-ceiling glass panes, originally designed as an orangery by some long-dead duke. Now, the glass allowed the blinding morning sun to pour in, heating the space to a comfortable, fragrant warmth. The smell of fresh pine shavings, linseed oil, and melting wax hit her like a physical force. The room was filled with massive workbenches, but it was not the benches that stopped her heart. It was what rested upon them. Henrietta walked slowly toward the nearest table, her eyes wide, entirely unable to process the sheer volume of the work. The entire surface of the bench was covered in a sprawling, meticulously carved wooden map. It was a topographical masterpiece. The mountains were raised, jagged pieces of dark walnut. The rivers were smooth, polished grooves of pale ash. The forests were created from hundreds of tiny, individual wooden dowels, each one sanded perfectly smooth. She reached out, trailing her fingers over the wood. It was entirely tactile. It was a map designed entirely for someone who could not see. She moved to the next table. Here, the wood gave way to an intricate, sprawling architectural model. It was a perfect, scaled replica of Ashford Manor itself. Every single staircase, every doorway, every massive fireplace was rendered in stunning obsessive detail. The roof of the model could be lifted away, allowing a small hand to reach inside and memorize the exact layout of the brutalist corridors, turning a terrifying prison into a predictable, navigable space. Elias had not just locked Beatrice in, he had rebuilt the entire world so she could hold it in her hands. "Miss Locke," Henrietta spun around. At the far end of the orangery, sitting on a high wooden stool, was Beatrice. The child was holding a small, delicate block of sandstone in her lap, rubbing a piece of coarse paper against it with intense concentration. "I knew you would come find the puzzle room," Beatrice said, smiling brightly. "Uncle Elias said you would likely map the entire ground floor before noon." Henrietta walked slowly down the aisle between the workbenches. The scale of Elias Thorne's devotion was crushing. It was a physical manifestation of a love so deep it defied all logic. "Where is your uncle?" Henrietta asked, her voice hushed, afraid to break the fragile atmosphere of the sunlit room. Beatrice pointed her sandstone block toward the corner of the orangery. "He is at the furnace." Henrietta turned her head. In the furthest, darkest corner of the glass room, a small, roaring brick furnace was burning white-hot. Standing in front of it, wearing a heavy leather apron over his white cotton shirt, was Elias. He was holding a long, hollow iron pipe. He was not looking at her. He was staring intensely into the heart of the fire, turning the iron pipe with slow, methodical precision. Henrietta moved closer, the heat from the furnace pressing against her skin. She stopped 10 feet away, completely captivated by the fluid, mesmerizing movement of his hands. The man who had shattered Julian Vance's wrist with terrifying ease was now rotating a glowing, molten blob of silica, with the delicate, unbroken rhythm of a watchmaker. Elias pulled the pipe from the fire. He brought it to his lips and blew, a slow, controlled exhalation. The molten glass expanded. It caught the sunlight pouring through the massive windows, shifting from glowing orange to a brilliant, translucent gold. He used a pair of heavy iron shears to pinch the molten bubble, pulling and shaping it with rapid, flawless movements. He worked the glass before it could cool, his large hands moving with absolute, unbroken confidence. He formed a beak. He pulled the delicate sweep of a wing. He pinched the tail feathers into a sharp, perfect fan. Within 2 minutes, the glowing mass had been transformed. Elias tapped the iron pipe gently with a wooden block. The glass snapped cleanly off, dropping onto a bed of soft ash to cool. Henrietta took a step forward, her eyes locked on the object resting in the ash. It was a bird. The glass bird flew over the mountain of jagged stones. The fairy tale was not just a story. It was an instruction manual. It was a blueprint. Elias had encoded the stories not just to protect his softness, but because the stories were real. He was actually building the things he wrote about. Elias turned around, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his leather-gloved hand. He saw her standing there, staring at the ash bed. He did not look surprised. He simply untied the leather apron, pulling it over his head and tossing it onto a nearby stool. He walked toward her, the dragging sound of his left foot entirely masked by the crackling of the furnace. "They take precisely 3 minutes to cool before they shatter if the ambient temperature is too low," Elias said, his voice dropping into the intimate, low register that sent a shiver straight up her spine. Henrietta looked from the glass bird to his face. "You built the cipher to hide this. Not just the stories, but the fact that you spend your days making toys for a blind child." Elias stopped 3 feet away from her. "The world views men like me as blunt instruments, Henrietta. A hammer is only useful if it is perceived as hard. If the War Office, if Julian Vance, knew that I spent my time blowing glass and carving wooden rivers, they would have taken her from me immediately. The state does not believe broken soldiers can raise children." He reached out, his hand hovering over the ash bed. He carefully picked up the glass bird by the wings. It was no longer glowing orange. It had cooled into a stunning, crystal-clear transparency. He held it out to her. Henrietta slowly raised her hands. She cupped her palms together, and Elias gently lowered the bird into them. The glass was still incredibly warm, radiating heat into her skin. It was perfectly smooth, flawlessly balanced. It weighed almost nothing, yet it felt heavier than the iron-bound ledger. "It is perfect," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Elias stepped entirely into her personal space. The scent of pine wood, smoke, and sweat wrapped around her, entirely intoxicating. He looked down at the delicate glass resting in her ink-stained hands. "It is fragile," Elias corrected quietly. "It requires an entirely different kind of protection than a ledger." He reached out and closed his hands over hers. The sheer size of his grip completely engulfed her fingers and the glass bird. The heat of his skin mixed with the heat of the glass, creating a profound burning anchor point in the center of her reality. Henrietta looked up. The pale gray eye was searching her face, looking for the walls she used to hide behind. But there were no walls left. The geometry of her mind had been entirely rewritten by the man standing in front of her. "I do not want to go back to London," Henrietta confessed. The words tumbled out of her mouth before she could subject them to logic or analysis. They were raw, bleeding truth. "I do not want to translate shipping manifests for men who see me as a machine." Elias's jaw tightened. He moved his hands, sliding them up her wrists, tracking the frantic, racing pulse beneath her skin. "You have no debt," he said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that she felt in her own chest. "You are the finest analytical mind in the country. You could demand a position at the War Office. You could write your own ticket to anywhere in the Empire." "I do not want the Empire," Henrietta said, taking a step forward, entirely closing the distance between them. The tip of her leather boot brushed against his. She looked up at the jagged, violent scars that mapped his face. "I want the mountain of jagged stones. I want the dragon." Elias stopped breathing. The stillness that overtook his massive frame was absolute. For 3 years he had operated under the assumption that he was unlovable. He had accepted his isolation as a necessary tactical sacrifice to keep Beatrice safe. He had never allowed himself to imagine a scenario where the fortress he built would be occupied by anyone else. Henrietta did not wait for his logic to catch up to his heart. She reached up, rising slightly onto her toes, and pressed her hand flat against the center of his chest. She could feel the heavy, violent thud of his heart against her palm. "You told me I was a demolition expert, Elias," she whispered, her face inches from his. "Let me prove it." Elias let out a ragged, breaking sound. His massive hands moved from her wrists to her waist, gripping her with a sudden, desperate possessiveness that shattered the last remaining atoms of his restraint. He pulled her flush against his chest, the physical impact stealing the breath from her lungs. He leaned down and kissed her. There was no clinical calculation in it. There was no hesitation. It was a collision. It was the crushing, overwhelming force of a man who had starved himself of human contact for 3 years, finally finding a source of heat. Henrietta gasped against his mouth, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his cotton shirt. The kiss was desperate, bruising, and entirely perfect. It tasted like smoke and salvation. She anchored herself against his massive frame, kissing him back with a fierce, demanding intensity that matched his own. The cold, analytical machinery of her mind shut down completely, overridden by the sensory overload of his touch, his scent, the heavy, desperate slide of his mouth against hers. He backed her slowly until her hips hit the edge of the heavy oak workbench. He did not break the kiss. He framed her face with his large, scarred hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones, tilting her head back to deepen the angle. Henrietta let out a soft, breathless sound, a sound of total surrender. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her fingers in his thick, dark hair. They broke apart slowly, gasping for air in the sunlit orangery. Elias rested his forehead against hers. His chest he heaved, his breathing ragged and uneven. He kept his hands firmly planted on her waist, refusing to let her move even an inch away from him. "You are entirely terrifying, Henrietta Locke," he murmured, his eyes closed, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I am highly efficient," she corrected breathlessly, resting her hands flat against his chest. "I identified a structural flaw in your isolation, and I remedied it." Elias laughed. The sound was a deep, rich rumble that bounced off the glass walls of the room. It was a sound entirely devoid of the monster. At the far end of the workshop, The tapping of the wooden cane resumed. Beatrice walked slowly down the aisle, her sandstone block forgotten. She stopped a few feet away, her unseeing eyes staring perfectly straight ahead. "Are we going to build a new room for Miss Locke?" Beatrice asked, tilting her head with innocent, ruthless perception. "Because she smells like she is going to stay, and the West Wing is entirely too drafty for a codebreaker." Elias opened his eyes. He looked down at Henrietta, the pale gray gaze filled with absolute, unwavering certainty. "She will not be staying in the West Wing, little bird," Elias said, his voice thick with a promise that felt as permanent as the stone foundations of the manor. He looked back down at Henrietta, his thumb brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. He traced the line of her jaw, mapping the coordinates of his new world. "Are you prepared to deal with the sheer volume of wood shavings this child tracks through the house?" he asked quietly. Henrietta smiled, the clinical mask gone forever, replaced by a radiant, terrifying vulnerability. "I have an eidetic memory for numbers, Elias. I will simply count them." The heavy iron gates of Ashford Manor stood open, buried under the snow. The road to London was clear, carving a dark path through the blinding white landscape. But no carriage arrived to take her away. No letters of debt came to demand her return. The trap had been dismantled. The villain had been executed by his own arrogance, and the walls of the fortress had finally come down. Henrietta stood by the massive windows of the orangery, watching the sun hit the snowdrifts, turning the Yorkshire moors into an ocean of diamonds. She held the glass bird in her hands, tracing its perfectly fragile wings. It was not a cage. It was a home. And the storm, she realized with perfect mathematical clarity, had known exactly what it was doing.